Tonight on Discovering, we're in the western UP in an area known as the Copper Country, and everywhere you turn, there's something to do with copper.
Searching for native copper here is definitely a treasure hunt.
So sit back and relax. It's Monday night, and it's time for Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone, forests thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak, surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields, call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill, the eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
Copper is ingrained in the spirit of the Keweenaw, as much as it is still embedded in the rocks, sands, and sidewalks.
It's almost impossible to escape copper. So you walk along the streets in Hancock, and you can see copper in the pavement that was mixed in with the aggregate. You know, it's just part of growing up here. We all kind of have an eye for copper.
So there's a little chunk of copper there, which is cool because it's connected to this piece of copper up here.
Copper was the first metal I really learned to work in. People specifically come in asking, I want a piece made of that UP copper, and they really like that idea of having a piece of local history.
We started with copper sculpture process where we're pouring the molten copper through straw that's immersed in water. There you're getting a three-dimensional shape, and then for some reason we had a splatter, and we decided, well, maybe we can do these wall art type of pieces. Basically on the splash copper, we're taking our trimmings from the lapidary operations, anything from the tumbling, and we're using as much as we can the local resource that's available, melt it down. The copper will melt at 1950 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus, but we're pouring it about 2200 degrees. Once we get the pour and we like the shape, we'll oxidize the piece. So it's like a green patina mix, our secret formula. And then we'll buff through and highlight the different areas that are there. Being that it's copper all the way through, you're going to end up with a beautiful contrast between the copper and the patina, which mimics the natural oxidation of your copper in the soils. We enjoy everything that we're doing. We're cutting and polishing the rocks from the area, the glacial copper that's from the area. If we can cut it, chop it up, make it into decorator specimens. Smithsonian handles our product, a lot of gift shops, and of course in our retail store in Houghton too.
I think that copper bringing something home, something tangible, is a huge benefit for people up here, but I really do think at the end of the day, it's the story behind why the copper is here and why this community exists, the changes that came with that industry, you know, the booms and the busts, both the good and the bad, I think are really compelling.
Well, the story of copper in the Keweenaw goes back thousands of years. People have been using copper that comes out of these hills for at least 5,000, maybe 7,000 years. The modern mining impact only dates back about 150 years.
And the unique thing about the area is not that we have native copper. If you go to Arizona or Russia, a lot of other big copper districts, you will find native metallic copper in place. But what unique is to this area is the sheer quantity of native copper. It's the only place in the world where you're not mining copper sulfides, copper oxides, you're mining chunks of metal underground for profit. And that is unique to the world over, that's unique to this district.
So how did this small sliver of land create such a massive amount of pure copper? I needed an expert in geology. Cue Professor Bornhorst.
The Keweenaw Peninsula's geology is quite special. There's a major geologic structure that's about 1.1 billion years old that starts in Kansas and comes up through Minnesota, follows the arc of Lake Superior, and goes through lower Michigan. This structure is called the Mid-Continent Rift System. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the geology of the Mid-Continent Rift, since it dominates the topography and geology of the western Upper Peninsula here of Michigan, particularly the Keweenaw Peninsula. So shown here on this map in color are the rocks that are associated with this major geologic structure. But all the rocks under Lake Superior are also dominated by this structure, the Mid-Continent Rift. So what is a rift? So let's talk about what a rift is. A rift is an area of the Earth's crust where hot rocks from depth rise and move outward. That outward movement causes the crust to stretch and to thin. And during that process of thinning, faults occur. Since these are hot rocks that rise, they produce magmas that then rise along these faults and fill this thinning crust. These rocks are usually basalt lava flows like you would see from Hawaii. As the rift continues to develop, you notice that the crust continues to thin, and we have a huge thickness of these rocks in green, which are basalts. And in the case of the Keweenaw Peninsula, among these rocks is one particular outstanding lava flow that is over 1,000 feet thick and is located from the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula all the way down to Houghton. And we call that lava flow the Greenstone Flow. This lava flow is arguably the world's largest single lava flow in terms of total volume of material. Over 1,000 cubic kilometers of magma were erupted into this one single lava flow. It's absolutely huge lava flow. So the rift then produced a large thickness of basalt lava flows. And these basalt lava flows were then overlain by sandstones and gravels. And late in the history of this rift, another very special event occurred. And that special event was the squeezing of this whole area and compression. And the reason for that is so special is because it's during that particular time that many faults and fractures were produced, and hot waters from deep within the rift moved upward and cooled and precipitated native copper in the tops of lava flows and sedimentary rocks in between them.
This is a really nice sample that was cut with a rock saw. And so you can see you have your calcite in there, and then you have your basalt, which is black, and you have your copper, which is copper colored. This piece was lacquered so the copper doesn't oxidize. But it kind of shows how the copper would have filled in the cracks in the basalt.
So the native copper deposits of the Keweenaw Peninsula extend essentially all the way from Copper Harbor all the way down south of Houghton. On this map here, you'll see here in brown are native copper occurrences, and these lines here represent veins. Now a vein is an area where you have basically a vertical crack in the rocks or an open space, and waters and fluids move along that crack and then precipitate out minerals that fill that crack. Among those minerals is native copper. Native copper essentially just means that it's pure copper. It's only the element copper.
Our copper is 99% pure copper underground. Our only impurity typically is silver, which is a benefit in most things. Any copper is used for electrical wiring, electrical transmission lines. This was the preferred copper for that.
It's impossible to tell the entire history of UP copper mining in 30 minutes, so we'll go about as deep into the history as one would find float copper. And that's where we'll start.
The early native peoples utilized copper from here, and they probably found it with what we call float copper, or copper that was carried by the glacier and strewn around the surface, oftentimes in rivers, etc., and they found all that. And then what? They ran out because they found most of it. So then what they obviously did is use the same color, and they found it in rock on the surface exposed. And so then they figured out how to mine.
So we believe that was an ancient mining pit, probably around 8,000 years ago. And what the archaeologists feel is that they would actually light a fire on top of the copper drift on the surface and take it down about 2 feet.
When the first European settlers came here, they'd hear stories of copper, and they would see copper artifacts and copper trinkets that the Native Americans would have in trade. And for a long time, there was this lore of this area where there was copper. The British actually came here in the mid-1700s and tried to mine copper. They failed miserably because they didn't understand geology and didn't know where to look, and they found one giant piece of this, they call it the glacial displaced copper, the famous Ontonagon boulder as they call it. And there was no other copper by that because it was moved by the glaciers, but they tried desperately to mine there. And then there was a few other failed attempts, and then finally in 1845 or 1846, the Cliff Mine was the first mine to actually come here and actually mine successfully up at the Cliff Mine.
So it was the first place to make money, and it made money at a time when the copper country was maybe not going to happen. People were a little bit afraid to invest, and so it proved to investors that you could bring money here, you could bring people here, and develop this area. They discovered the vein at the top of the bluff, but it was only maybe an inch thick. And then they came down halfway, and it was only a couple inches thick. And then they came down to the base of the bluff here, or the cliff, and they found that it was over a foot wide, the vein. And then they dug in and they found a 70-ton mass of copper. This is kind of like the incubator for ideas in terms of how copper mining was going to proceed. So if you go to the Quincy mine, you're going to see big, huge pieces of technology, big shaft rock house, a big engine hoist, things like that. All of those ideas had their genesis here, just at a much, much smaller scale.
In the late 1850s and early 1960s, more mines opened, including the Quincy Mine, located just north of Hancock.
The Quincy Mine, that was the deepest mine shaft, over 9,200 feet. That was the deepest mine shaft in the entire North American continent until almost 1990.
Shaft number 2 reached down 92 levels, so it'd be a little deeper. Okay.
The richest native copper lode was discovered in the 1860s underneath present-day Calumet. In 1871, the Calumet and Hecla mining companies merged and became one of the world's largest and richest copper mines. Throughout this period, companies created better mining, milling, and smelting technologies to extract and process copper. Underground, the men had done all the mining by hand.
Now, originally the drilling would have looked a little something like this. So you'd have a drill steel. It would have been much longer. Put it in the wall. You'd have one guy holding it and 2 guys with sledgehammers, and they'd strike it, drill about 14 holes, and then pack them full of black powder and blast them.
Mining practices modernized in the 1880s with power rock drills and dynamite.
One man runs the drill into the wall 6 to 8 feet, already doubling what the men initially were doing. Another man's job is to pour water on this to cool the drill.
A lot of people don't realize it, but around 1900, which was the peak of this mining area here, the Keweenaw copper mines controlled the whole copper market. They were the biggest producers, they had the best quality copper, and literally they were the go-to place for copper in the whole world wide. I believe in 1916, they produced almost 300 million pounds of copper in that 1 year alone.
From 1845 to 1960, the total production of Michigan's copper mines totaled over 11 billion pounds.
It really reached its heyday in the early 20th century and then began kind of a slow decline that didn't fully stop until the 1960s. Activities then moved further west out to the White Pine Mine, but it was a very different type of mining than what you saw here.
And they closed down in 1998 as the last mining operation in this area.
When they were operating, I used to get a lot of copper, especially the big sheet copper pieces that we always cleaned up for specimens. Now those are very, very rare and very collectible.
Copper mining might be a thing of the past here in the UP, but copper is still very much alive in the culture of the Keweenaw. Scattered across the copper country are bits and pieces of the copper story, ready to be explored and put together.
The first place we send them is the Keweenaw National Historic Parks Visitor Center. They do such a fantastic job. They have a 3-story museum, and very knowledgeable staff, and they will tell you sort of start to almost finish, right, sort of what to expect and what happened in the area. Once that happens, I think that gives you a greater appreciation of what you'll see outside of the visitor center. Places like the Coppertown USA Mining Museum, which is right behind us here. But once they have the opportunity to visit some of these other sites, we encourage people to go outside and get on trails. You know, one of the most popular attractions in the Keweenaw are these things called ghost towns. You know, we're not talking about the paranormal activity. We're talking about the buildings, the infrastructure that were local mine sites.
We're at the Cliff Mine. There was a several-story high stone shaft house here. As you can see, that's all collapsed now. All that remains is that large wall. So workers came in through this causeway here and then descended into the mine right behind where you're standing. The Keweenaw County Road Commission owns the property, and there aren't formal tours here, but there is kind of an informal trail system. For me, what makes this site awesome is that it has an opportunity for discovery. So you can kind of experience the site on your own and ask your own questions, and then hopefully go out and search for those answers somewhere, whether it's at a museum or another one of the historic mine sites that offer tours.
Of the Quincy Mine, right outside of Hancock, where you can actually go in, take a tram, go underground and see what it was really like to work in the 1860s in an active copper mine.
So for every 2,000 pounds of rock, 40 pounds of it would be copper.
There are a number of other mines that can be toured, including the Delaware Mine, the Adventure Mine down in Ontonagon County.
Actually, the Adventure is the original name. It's not a tourist name. It was always called the Adventure Mining Company from 1850 onward. So we do offer a few different tours here. The basic ones are going in the first level of mine. We are walking on mostly level ground.
It's an old stope, and a stope is a room underground in which they removed copper.
And then beyond that, we have a longer one, which uses rope works and rappelling. You're in a harness going down an interior shaft down to the second level of the mine. And then finally, we do offer what we call a captain's tour, which is about 6 hours long, and that goes through the whole second level of the mine. We strive at a mine site here to leave everything as it was on the site. From underground, we have no electric lights. We have hard hats and headlamps. Try to minimize the modern impact of the mine site and leave it as it was.
The importance of the Quincy smelter is that it's an excellent way to get the story of not just the mining of copper, but also what happened at the end, when that copper is melted down into marketable raw products that can then be shipped out on giant steamships that went back east or to Chicago or Detroit. And then from there, it could be rolled into copper wire to help the electrification of America.
And so they'd fill the mold and that would swing around here. Now each of these ladles has a specific opening, as you can see, and each ladle has a specific mold that matches the opening.
The A.E. Seaman Mineral Museum in Houghton is a must-stop for anyone interested in our copper legacy.
But when you enter the museum, there's a very large sheet of native copper from the White Pine Mine, so that's very impressive. Just past that, our best exhibit of our most important specimens has a lot of native copper there, and then just beyond that is a whole gallery devoted to the Keweenaw. And this takes you through some of the mine history, going from the early miners on through more modern times. And then the other thing we're really well known for in the area is the copper that's included in the calcites. You can see the untarnished color of the copper.
Searching for native copper here is definitely a treasure hunt.
The museum, along with Keweenaw Gem and Gift, hosts an annual Mineral Days event, providing legal surface-prepared mineral collecting on rock piles of former native copper mines.
This is a central mine. It was one of the largest vein deposits in the Keweenaw. It's only a few miles from the Cliff deposit. This site is owned by Keweenaw County, and you're allowed to come here, but not when there's people working here. So when the gates open, you can't come because they're obviously hauling rock in and out. But when the gates close and there's no action in here, then people are allowed to come here and collect.
That's a chisel chip. When they were mining the copper in here, they didn't have a good way to cut the big chunks of copper apart. And so they had to use chisels. And they wind up with chips like that of copper.
People are finding the copper here today by the use of a metal detector. You can find copper just by looking down and seeing the right colors. And there's luck involved in this. So you don't come out here expecting you're going to get rich. You come out here to have fun and be outside. And it's the thrill and excitement of finding something on your own and making a discovery from this rock pile.
From museums to mine tours to digging in the dirt to creating art, there are plenty of ways to experience the rich copper history here in the UP.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you next week right here on Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.